Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Jo Alexander. I'm a business analyst for EMRS, and in honour of the upcoming delivery year for the capacity market, I'll be highlighting some key obligations you need to know about as suppliers. Here we have the increasingly common disclaimer slide, where we try to politely remind you that this webinar is supposed to help, but please be mindful that the regulations take precedence and the numbers we use are examples. So here's the agenda slide. This is what we are going to cover within the next hour. Please submit questions as we go along using the webinar functionality. My colleague Abdal is sitting next to me and will endeavour to answer the questions directly whilst I am going through the slides. Please be patient, as there are over 100 people signed up to this webinar, so this could prove to be quite a busy hour for him. Any questions that we can't answer today, we will get back to you with in due course. In addition, I will stop 3 times during the webinar to see if there have been any key or recurring questions to answer for all to hear, but I won't disclose who asked them, so feel free to submit questions anonymously. As there isn't much time, we're not going to give a high-level overview of the capacity market, so please see our website for material on what the capacity market is all about. Today's first couple of slides will concentrate on payments and what data they rely on. Then, as credit cover and the supplier charge are connected, we'll be covering them together, starting from the submission of the demand forecast up until what the invoice and backing data looks like, so you can validate what we are sending. We will have a break to address questions before moving on how non-compliance is dealt with. The second part of our webinar looks briefly at the penalty residual supplier amount, which is a payment out to suppliers before diving into reconciliation. Hopefully, you are somewhat familiar with the concept of reconciliation, and today we will see how it works under the capacity market. At the end of this webinar, the aim is that you will be equipped with the knowledge to meet your obligations as suppliers, be able to validate your invoices, and know where to go for more information if required. So first of all, briefly, where does EMRS fit in? So at the very top, we've got BASE, which was formerly known as DEC. They set the policy for the capacity market and wrote the regulations. They set up a company known as Electricity Settlements Company, abbreviated to ESC in these slides. So they have 100% ownership of that organisation. We have Matt Johnson in the room from ESC, so keep those questions coming, and here will be able to provide some input. Then ESC have given EMR Settlement Limited, that's EMRS, who I work for, they have given us the contract to provide services on their behalf. So we receive meter data, calculate payments and charges, do the invoices and monitor the payments received, manage reconciliations of payments. We also hold and manage reserve amounts and credit cover. Sorry, reserve amounts was on the CFD side. It's just credit cover for the capacity market. Apologies. So we do those things on behalf of ESC, and that is why we are holding this webinar today. So the capacity market payments. The payments fall into 2 main groups, as shown on the slide. Firstly, the first pot is the capacity market payments. They fund the payments to capacity providers. These 3 payments, as you can see, will be the focus for our webinar today, as they will be happening for the first time with the delivery year starting in October. The second group is to fund the scheme administration. We're not going to go through the settlement cost levy today, as this should be business as usual by now. The first pot is protected by credit cover and a process called mutualisation, which we'll come back to later. But just to highlight, as it's different from the CFD scheme, all payments are due 3 working days after billing. So it's quite a quick turnaround time. Make sure you pay your invoices quickly, please. So on to capacity market metered data. In working out how much to charge each supplier, the important period is 4 to 7 p.m. on working days in November to February. This is known as a period of high demand. During this period of high demand, it is a net volume that is used, which includes embedded generation and applied distribution losses. Those are the general principles, but looking at the 4 payments in the table, you can see that there are differences in which BSC data runs are used. The capacity market supplier charge, which I will just refer to as the supplier charge for the purposes of this webinar, and the reconciliation amount, they both start by using forecast data for the period of high demand. And then the supplier charge uses up to the R2 run, whereas reconciliation can take into account the dispute run. The settlement cost levy only uses the SF run from the BSC, and the penalty residual supply amount is completely different to all the others in being based on how much of the supplier charges you have paid, rather than the metered data. So this is something to bear in mind when validating your invoices. So on to the main bulk of our presentation today. This is all about the credit cover and the supplier charge. So here's a timeline for 2016-2017 delivery year. So that slide shows from June all the way to September, but the delivery year itself starts in October. So it starts with a demand forecast, which everyone submitted. So we will return to this timeline again to discuss other labels, but I want to show you one slide for the demand forecast before moving on. So suppliers must provide a demand forecast for the period of high demand by no later than the 1st of June prior to each delivery year to which the forecasted data demand relates. So we have received all the forecasts we were expecting, so just want to take this moment to thank everyone for their cooperation with this process. So we need the forecast as it is used to calculate each supplier's capacity market supplier charges. So that's the purpose. And that is an example forecast form on the right-hand side. So back to the timeline on the supplier charge payments. After collecting in the demand forecast for the period of high demand in the upcoming delivery year, we issued each supplier with a schedule for its supplier charge and credit cover for the year. This showed the deadlines for the provision of credit cover, the first being the 15th of September, and it also showed the monthly capacity supplier charge that each supplier will be liable to pay for each month. The first one being the 3rd of October, as they are issued on the first working day of each month. So thinking about that supplier charge and the schedule a bit more, remember that this is based on the forecast for the period of high demand. The schedule shows the whole of the year, but in March we will actually have the actual data to replace the forecast, so we will issue a revised schedule. This will also take into account any revision to the total capacity market payments that are going out. So how do we calculate these? So payments are made to fund capacity providers for each month, so they're inherently linked. The expected monthly costs are apportioned to each supplier by share of demand. Remember, that's the period of high demand, either on forecasted or then eventually actual data. The total annual capacity payments are determined from the capacity market auction results. And the monthly weighting factor profiles are applied to make the payments during the year higher in the months where a stress event is more likely, so during the winter months. So for your monthly capacity market supplier charge, that equals the total annual capacity payments times by the monthly weighting factor. And we've actually recently published those weighting factors on our website. Then that is times by the supplier's net demand over the net demand of all suppliers. So let's move on to an example. Please remember that these are purely fictional numbers and a fictional supplier. And the example invoice that we have displayed, we use data, fictional data and dates from 2014. So obviously your one should show 2016 when you receive it in October. So the invoice on the right had a line that said supplier charge for October 2014 was £9 million. But on the left we've put down some numbers to show you how we got to that number. So the monthly total capacity provider payments for October 2014, remember, completely made up, £60 million. This fake supplier's net demand for 2014-15 delivery year, remember that's periods of high demand, were forecasted at 1.8 megawatt hours. And the fictional all suppliers' net demand for the 2014-15 delivery year, periods of high demand, we made up to be 12 million megawatt hours. So using the calculation we displayed on the slide before, that's 60 million times by basically that supplier's market share. So just a little note, that 60 million was the monthly amount for October. That has already had the weighting factor applied against the annual amount. So obviously the invoice doesn't show those calculations on the left-hand side, but you do receive backing data. So let's have a look at the backing data. All backing data starts with the same 6 columns and contains the EMR party ID, the invoice number, the invoice issue date, the payment date, the total, and your MPID. Then the key DFlow to note is D0364, the CM supplier invoice backing data. And we've got a little link at the bottom of the slide. The key resource is from Marasco's website, because you'll see the backing data has items like J1923. We've put what those items mean, so delivery year month above those in the slide. But if you ever forget what these data items mean, the key to all the codes is on Marasco's website. So that's where the numbers come from. So the total monthly capacity payments are in J2029 column. That was the 60 million. Going along to the right, we've got the supplier net demand, and then the net demand for all the periods of high demand. And the final column is the net payment. The reference periods are the periods of high demand, just so you know. Okay. So related to your capacity market supplier charge is credit cover. But what credit cover do you actually need? They are provided in your schedule, but just note they're not cumulative, so each month is its own requirement. And they are linked because they are 110% of your monthly capacity market supplier charge. So in the example we used on the slide before, that charge was £9 million. So times that by 1.1, and you get £9.9 million credit cover is required. Now please remember you need to have lodged that amount, or at least that amount, you can lodge more if you wish, to meet the monthly requirement 12 working days in advance of the month. So we have spoken to some suppliers who are considering lodging a large amount to meet their highest requirement in their schedule. But other suppliers, you are free to revisit every month to adjust your position. It's completely up to you to maintain, to ensure you have sufficient credit cover in place with us. Now, that credit cover can be provided in cash or letter of credit. But please be mindful, look at our working practices on our website because the letter of credit process has recently changed to an electronic format to make it more efficient. And you'll need to get your bank to issue a letter of credit via their SWIFT process. Okay, but there's all the details you need in our working practice, including where to send those. So, this is our first break for questions. I'm just going to look at my colleague to see if we've got any important questions we should raise. Okay, great. Thank you very much. We've had a few questions in. The key ones are, people are asking for copies of the slides. Good point. I should have mentioned the copies of the slides and a recording of this webinar will be available tomorrow on our website, and you'll get a link via email, and that will be to our YouTube channel. It's actually our parent company, Alexon's YouTube channel, so don't be confused when Alexon comes up because they do own EMRS, so we're using their channel. And the other key question that is worth sharing with everyone is what ID flow would the backing data come on? So that is a D0364. There will also be a CSV file, which will be easier to view in Excel. So some suppliers have requested backing data to be sent via the DTN, but others have selected email. The data is all the same. Okay, Thank you very much. So keep those questions coming. We're now going to turn on to what happens if a supplier doesn't comply. So there are processes in place to ensure that ESC has the required funds in place to meet their obligation to pay capacity providers if a supplier doesn't meet their obligations. So if someone doesn't comply, we've got something in place to try to minimise the impact on the rest of the market and capacity providers themselves. So the first one we're going to talk about today is credit cover and mutualisation. Credit cover is a guarantee that there is enough money to pay an invoice. So if it's not lodged in time, then there is a risk that there will be non-payment of an invoice, and if we don't have the credit cover in place, there isn't enough to draw down to cover it. We'll go through the timings of drawdown on the next slide. So as there is no reserve fund, unlike under the CFD scheme, to dip into in the event of a shortfall in collection, we need to mutualise in advance of anyone missing their invoice. If someone doesn't pay their invoice, there's another process. It's the non-payment process that's triggered, and that involves drawing down on credit cover, if there is any, and taking escalating actions. So they're completely two separate processes. We could do mutualisation, and then the supplier that has not complied may pay their invoice, and non-payment may not need to be triggered. So they are completely independent processes, so just worth bearing that in mind. So we're going to go on to the timeline for credit cover and mutualisation now. So as we said previously, credit cover needs to be lodged monthly or if you want to lodge more in advance, that's fine, but no later than 12 working days before the commencement of the relevant month. You need to have the correct amount in the correct form in place with us. So all the deadlines are in the schedule you've received already. So not lodging credit cover is a first sign a supplier may be in difficulty. If the required amount of credit cover has been provided, you'll be notified by 9 working days before the commencement of the relevant month. But it's not provided, we will actually notify you of that fact as well. You will also be entered onto the credit default register as being in stage 1 credit default. This credit default register is published on ESC's website. We'll actually give a link to ESC's website at the end of this presentation so you can explore it. But after receiving the notice, the supplier must provide the credit cover by no later than 5 working days after the notice, which, if they do provide it, will determine whether the credit support is approved by no later than 2 working days before the commencement of the month. However, if it's not provided or it's not on the correct amount or form, then we'll put you on the credit default register as being in capacity market stage 2 credit default in respect of that month. And that's a trigger for mutualisation. So that supplier's monthly capacity charge will be mutualised amongst all the non-defaulting suppliers. In addition, any credit amounts that are due to this defaulting supplier will be withheld, so we'll be making payments out because we may expect them not to pay an invoice. So that was a timeline. Now let's move on to the mutualisation calculation. So if this particular misbehaving supplier reaches stage 2 credit default and their supplier charge is mutualised amongst the non-defaulting suppliers, this is a high-level calculation that we apply. So the amount is a defaulting supplier's amount times by the particular non-defaulting supplier's net demand over the total non-defaulting supplier's net demand. Again, when I say net demand, that's all about the periods of high demand. If the defaulting supplier pays the mutualised amount, so if they do pay their invoice, they only had issues with their credit cover, so they paid their invoice, then the non-defaulting suppliers who made a mutualisation payment will receive a mutualisation credit at the next reconciliation run. So you will get your money back. So on the theme of showing you some example invoices so you know what to expect, here is the same invoice, example invoice that we showed before, but we're looking at the second line, the supplier charge mutualisation for October 2014. So in this fake example, we've got 6 million as the defaulting supplier's capacity market supplier charge. The non-defaulting supplier's net demand is 1.8 million megawatt hours, and the total non-defaulting suppliers net demand is 10.8 million megawatt hours. So in that calculation, we do the 10 million times 1.8 divided by 10 million. Sorry, I think that should be 6 million, okay? Times by 1.8 divided by 10. Apologies for that, but that will come out as £1 million contribution to the mutualisation amount. So backing data, very similar. You'll get backing data with this invoice, and it will have some columns relating to the mutualisation amount. So the same 6 columns apply, so let's look at the ones that are different. And that's how we use the numbers. So the amount in default is the first column, right the way through to the supply mutualisation amount. So it's the same information again, and if you need to know what the J1893 is, for example, please visit Moresco's website, the link we provided on a previous slide. So what happens if a supplier doesn't pay? So there's escalating actions here. We've got a non-payment register, so a bit similar to the credit default register. It's published on the ESC website. The supplier's name is on there for 12 months. Then EMRS will chase and issue your non-payment notice. That counts as, it's called slightly different in the regs, but it's basically you haven't paid the invoice, so you're issuing an official notice as the regs say has to be done. And ESC will be informed, and we may use credit cover if it's available, and then you'll be entered onto the credit cover default register as we have used your credit cover. And ultimately, Ofgem, the regulator of the market, will be notified, and they do have powers around supplier licensing, so we can report non-compliance to Ofgem. So just to note, we didn't put mutualisation on this escalating arrow because, again, it happens in advance of non-payment, as we have shown in the previous slides. So the timeline for the non-payment of supplier charge, it's a little bit different, obviously, to credit cover. So they issue the invoice on the first working day of the month. So, as I said before, that's the 3rd of October. Remember that date. You have 3 working days to turn that around and make the payment. And then, if you haven't made the payment, we'll be chasing you. And that official notice is issued 3 working days later. And we will be initiating credit card drawdown 2 working days later. There is no further mutualisation because, again, it's already happened. If the supplier isn't in credit cover default and mutualisation didn't happen to start off with, then there should be enough credit cover to draw down on to cover the payment. So all's good there. But then if the supplier is in credit cover default, then we've already collected in the money when the payments are due from that invoice from other suppliers. Please note that this timeline works for the supplier charge, but it's a slightly different timeline when there's a payment default on reconciliation, just because of the nature of those timelines that we'll come on to later. So we've shown the escalating actions for mutualisation and the non-payment timeline. Now, just one bit to note before we move on is the late payment interest. So not only are there actions we take that affect the whole market, such as mutualisation, the supplier that isn't complying will be charged late payment interest to the amount that is outstanding. That's applied to the capacity market supplier charge, the settlement cost levy, which we've already been invoicing for quite a while now, and any reconciliation amounts. So they all have late payment interest applied. So that's actually charged at 5% per annum over the Bank of England base rate, which we're aware of is quite low at the moment, but that'd be around 5.25%, I believe. And it all depends on the rate that they have at the time. So the rate for January to June will use a Bank of England rate in force on the 31st of December the previous year. And then if they update it, the rate for July to December will use the rate they put in force on the 30th of June. And any, just to note, any interest accrued on the settlement cost levy in the year will be refunded to suppliers. Obviously the suppliers who are due it, not those who caused it. So this is another break for our questions. Just turning to see, have you got any questions we need to answer? Yep, okay, we've got a few. Brilliant, thanks guys. So the first question is, if your net demand position is expected as 0, will you still receive invoices? Good question. And no, you won't receive any invoices, so you don't need to worry when nothing appears in your inbox from us. The second question is, are the monthly waiting factors for invoicing published and available? Yes. So we plan to publish the monthly waiting factors on EMRS website before the delivery year. The ones for this delivery year are actually online now, so you can have a look at those. Again, we'll have a slide at the very end with all these website links, so don't worry too much about that. Another question, this is an interesting one. Yep, can you dispute invoices? Yes, you can dispute the invoices, but because of the tight timelines, you do need to pay them, and because the dispute process takes a little while, but there is a process for that. Which data flow is the mutualisation data in? That is actually contained in D0364. And the last question we've got that we're going to share with everyone is, are suppliers obliged to ensure non-defaulting capacity market payment in their license conditions? Suppliers are obliged to make capacity market payments under their license. The regulations oblige all licensed electricity suppliers to make these payments. So sorry, no getting out of that. Great. So that's good. It seems like people are submitting questions and making use of Abdal. I can see him typing away, responding to people. So that's brilliant. Keep them coming. We will have another break point for questions as we go through the webinar, because now we're going to move on to penalty residual supply amount. Only a couple of slides on this. It's a fairly simple little payment. Unfortunately, it may never happen, and here is why. It is a method of disputing out to suppliers any capacity provider penalty payments which remain. And I mean remain because penalties fund over delivery payments to capacity providers, so there may not be any left. So this only applies where one or more stress events have occurred in the delivery year, because when a stress event occurs, capacity providers are obliged to deliver. So that might be an increase in their generation or a decrease in their demand. If they don't deliver, there are penalties. If they over-deliver, there is a potential for over-delivery payments. So if there are net penalties collected from capacity providers left over, and a particular supplier, if you have paid your supplier charges in that delivery year, then at the end of the year, if there's any residual amount, you will get some of that back. So be mindful, this may happen, but only if those 3 conditions are met will you receive any amount. So the calculation is the residual capacity provider penalties times by the supplier charge paid by the supplier over the total supplier charges paid by all. So it's your share of things paid. So not on your meter data, but on what you have paid compared to what everyone else has paid. And this calculation will be performed after the end of the delivery year. So remember, because the delivery year starts in October, this won't be done until early November. And the credit note is issued 26 working days after the end of the delivery year. So don't need to worry about that quite yet. You've got over a year to go before you potentially see that on any invoice or credit note. So let's look at reconciliation. This is quite a few slides on reconciliation. We look first at monthly reconciliation and then annual reconciliation. Now, just to make sure we're all on the same page here, reconciliation is a process at a high level by which we look to correct what was invoiced or credited using updated information. So it happens under the BSC, which hopefully you're all familiar with our data runs, and this concept has been carried across into the EMR schemes. So just a slide stating what we reconcile. So the supplier charge is reconciled, so is mutualisation, and penalty residual supply amounts, again if there are any. You might notice that the settlement cost levy is not in that circle, that is not reconciled. So some of the factors influencing why we reconcile and things we take account of. So any revised or additional data, just like under the BSC. Got the mutualisation amounts, so as we said, if payments are made, that's returned in reconciliation. Payments that are made after the due date, that all is factored in. If a supplier's license is terminated and they exit the market, this obviously affects market share calculations. Payments made in previous reconciliation runs are taken into account. And any adjustments that are payable capacity providers. So if we don't have all the capacity providers delivering the delivery year, so if we've got any terminations that have happened, got a few high-profile ones in the news recently, some of you may have noticed. We've really done the calculation about what people need to pay in. If that pot changes, then that adjustment is taken into account in reconciliations. And any disputes, which someone rightly questioned, there is a dispute process, so that is taken into account during reconciliation. So the timeline. These are dictated by regs, and a run needs to be commenced by the end of the relevant month, so for instance, October, 90 working days we have for the first reconciliation run. For the second reconciliation run, we have 160 working days. For the third, you can see 295 working days. That might seem a bit random, but for those of you who are a bit more familiar with BSC, they are aligned with the BSC data availability roughly. So the first one being when we should get R2 data in, second R3, and the third RF. So that's why those dates are there. Within these timescales, redetermination of the invoices and the payment activities obviously occurs. There's its own separate timeline, which I did mention briefly before when we showed you the timeline for invoices of the supplier charge. This one's slightly different. We've got the redetermination, and we take 2 working days to do that and issue out the invoices. You've got 3 working days before the payment is due, just like your other charges under the capacity market, so remember that quick turnaround time. And then we can draw down existing credit cover if we need to, if that payment isn't made. And then we'll recalculate any credit amounts and issue the credit notes, and then pay the credit 3 working days later. Now, you notice, hopefully, that there's an invoice and then a credit. We collect money in, and then if not all money is collected in, we're going to have to resize the credit notes out. So we can't pay out more than we collect in because it's supposed to be a zero-sum game, and we don't have any pots to dip into to make up the shortfall. Okay, so on to monthly reconciliation. It's very simple calculation. It calculates the difference between the supplier charge a supplier has already paid for a month and the redetermined supplier charge for that month. So it's just the difference between the two. Just a note, it takes into account the transition from forecast to metered data, the adjustments to capacity provider payments that are payable, and mutualisation credits. So just a little reminder of what we're looking at there. The metered data, worth noting, because sometimes people get a little bit confused. Remember, bear in mind, it's at periods of high demand that is really important to remember. So even though we're reconciling October's invoice, it's not about October's data, it's all about the periods of high demand, November to February. So for a little bit, we will have a mixture of metered data and forecast data for the period of high demand. Remember that forecast you submitted, we had one value for each month. So we need to wait for the whole of February's data to come through. So it isn't until towards the end of March that we have all the metered data, and we will replace all the forecasts with that and do reconciliation calculations based on it. So here's another example invoice, but different this time round because we've got the reconciliation amount for October 2014. And it is worth noting that this invoice is issued in, well, on this example, in February. So remember, it's because it's 90 working days from the end of the relevant month. So it will show in February, roughly, you will see the reconciliation amount for October. So on the left-hand side, we've put up the numbers again, just so you can see how we determined that £2 million. So the actual monthly total capacity provider payments for October 2014, again, it's all made up, there wasn't a delivery year then, was £49 million in this example. The supplier's net demand for this periods of high demand, which had actual data for November and December was 1.5 million megawatt hours, and all suppliers' net demand for the same period was 10.5 million megawatt hours. So there we go, we've got the new redetermined amount being £7 million. But if you remember from way back earlier in the slides, they actually paid £9 million. So they are due a credit of £2 million, which is nice. In this example, of course, if the redetermined amount means you have to pay more, then you will have an invoice. Remember that invoice, it happens before the credit notes are issued. And please don't take any stock by the dates here. They are example dates. So you have to look at our settlement calendar for when these are expected. Just like we did before, let's have a little look at the backend data. So we haven't shown the first 6 columns, as we've said before, they are the same on all backend data. So these are the different ones. We've got the payment amount for the first group, and then the metered volumes come on the right-hand side. Because it's quite a lot of numbers on one slide, let's have a little look at them individually. So these are the payment amounts. So that was just the last slide, halved and put on a slide on its own, so you're not too overwhelmed. So the first bit takes into account any reduction in payments payable to capacity providers. That's the total monthly capacity payments that we've redetermined. The other bit is the amounts of the meter data for November and December, and the forecast data for the supplier's net demand over the total net demand. And then putting those into the calculation, we've got the £2 million in the column on the far right, and that's what you're paying. For those you may have noticed, you're going to have to look at the backing data associated with October's supplier charge for what the original amounts were, because that's the one we don't include on this reconciliation backing data. And it's all about what you have paid. That's the important bit to note. So the second group of columns we had was the metered data. So we've got the net demand detail for a settlement date. Those rows are repeated. So we've got the same things repeated 6 times there. And that's because it needs to correspond to the settlement periods. So for one settlement date, you've got the settlement periods for the periods of high demand. So that's why we've only got 6 there. We've got the 4 to 7 p.m. periods, okay? So that's one settlement date. And as a result, the ones on the right should add to the ones on the left. And those columns should add up to those on the left as well. So that's how that works. We're now going to go on to annual reconciliation. So we've done monthly. Let's look at annual. So it's very similar. It's all about what should have been paid and what was paid. And then we've got a faded out square circle. So if there was a penalty residual amount, we do reconcile in the annual process. It's all about the differences. So we have 3 annual reconciliation runs happen for each delivery year. Please note that there may be an additional one. If required, ESC can determine if they want to run another one. But in general, there'll be 3. It follows the same timeline as monthly reconciliations. So only those numbers to remember. The 90, the 160, and the 295. But the difference here is it's the end of the relevant year. So whereas before we were looking at October, the end of October, 90 working days later, this is the end of the whole delivery year when we start counting 90 working days. So how the supplier charge payment for October 2016 will be reconciled. Just taking October as an example here, just try to walk it through so you can see how it all sort of fits together. So the first monthly invoice is in February, and the credit notes are in towards the end of February. Remember, we collect things in before we pay things out. And we've got dates for the second monthly reconciliation run and the third monthly one. But as you know, at the top of that timeline, the BAC calendar is released around March, and then the EMR calendar will be updated, and the annual reconciliation dates will be known. So at the moment on this slide, we've got sort of a rough sort of point at January for the first annual run, May for the second, and November for the third. But please do check our website for when we publish the updated EMR calendar for all the important dates. One thing to note is that once annual reconciliations start, then monthly reconciliations stop. So not every month of delivery year will have 3 monthly reconciliations. So we saw October there. That one does have 3, but let's have a look at this table and it shows you which ones do and which ones don't. So October and November will have 3 monthly reconciliations. So reading this table, look at the month, then look down. December, January, February, March, April and May, they have the first monthly reconciliation and the second one, but no third monthly reconciliation, because that's when the annual ones have already started. June, July, August only have 1 monthly reconciliation, but then at September, because that's the end of the delivery year, there's no first, there's no second, and there's no third monthly reconciliation, because the annual ones have started. So you still get the whole redetermination and the invoices and the credit notes being issued, but as part of the annual process, rather than having the 2 in parallel. So that was quite a heavy section, all about monthly and annual reconciliations. You know the drill now. We're going to look at the questions. So we've got a few here, pages and pages. Right. So can a negative net demand forecast be submitted? Right, I can see where you're coming from there. However, for all those who have loads of embedded generation, unfortunately the answer is no. The net demand under CM is capped at 0. It's to stop the negative market share resulting in supplier charges being paid to supplier, because that's not the aim of the scheme. It's supposed to be paying capacity providers. It's a nice try there. Is embedded generation used in the calculation of supplier payments? Yes, so it is the net demand. So therefore it does include embedded generation, i.e. your E_BM units. Again, in this calculation it's always capped at 0. So even if you do have a negative demand in your meter data, it's capped at 0 in the calculations anyway. So you can't submit forecasts and actual data can't be negative either. The next question is all about invoicing. So are the invoicing companies for CM and CFD intending on aligning the minimum invoice issue value as per Lexon's minimum threshold? So yeah, we are owned by Lexon, but it's very, very different. We have the regulations to abide by. Lexon's minimum threshold is £500, but that's completely irrelevant for EMRS because we, as we said, look at the regulations. So there's no plans at this moment. We have set up direct debit functionality to reduce operational efforts on parties, so please submit your direct debit mandates to our contact mailbox, which will have the last slide of this presentation, and then you won't need to worry. Even if it's £1, it'll get taken automatically. The next question is, are there any indicative costs in terms of £1 megawatt hour suppliers need to pay under CM? So that's I think because people are quite used to the whole rate under CFD. So the CM doesn't use the concept of a rate, a pounds per megawatt hour rate, like the CFD. It's all about the total amount of the capacity payments, and you can actually look at the CM register to see who's got an agreement, what their obligation is in terms of the megawatts they're committed to, and the clearing price of the auction. So you can sort of see what that pot's going to be through those sources. The CM register, as worth pointing out, is on National Grid's delivery website. So they have the role of delivery body, they run the auctions, and they publish the register there. Last 2 questions. Will the reconciliation amounts be on the same invoice, and which flow is the backend data in? So yes, the reconciliation invoices are they're actually separate to the initial invoice, but the backend data is in the D0364 flow. And just a reminder, look at Marasco for the flows and data items. And the final question that we're sharing to everyone, although Abdul has been replying to individual questions, is, are capacity charges only applicable for periods of high demand? So, yeah, interesting question, because I've been referring quite a bit to the periods of high demand. That's only for the demand itself. The charges are applicable for the whole delivery year. So it's your share of demand in the periods of net demand. but your charges are payable throughout the delivery year, and the payments to capacity providers are paid out throughout the delivery year as well. That's all we've got for the relevant questions on that section. I've only got a couple more slides left of this webinar, and that's to look at a summary and sources for further information. Just had a look, everyone seems to be still with us, so that's great. We've still got a lot of attendees on the webinar, so thanks for sticking with us. Only a couple more slides to go. Let's have a little look at what we've talked about today. This slide is all about the supply activities linked to a delivery year. So the demand forecast we spoke about right at the very beginning almost, that's already happened for this delivery year, but please remember it's an annual thing. You're going to have to do it again next June. So that's all about submitting your forecast for the periods of high demand in that delivery year coming up, and that's used to calculate your credit cover and supplier charge payments. So work in practice 5 on our website and guidance document 12 are the important ones to note. You can submit a 0 demand, you can't submit a negative demand. And if you submit zeros, then you won't have anything, any invoices issued to start off with. But don't worry, we'll catch up with those in reconciliation. The credit cover, you need to lodge it. Valid credit cover for each month of delivery year. Of course, you can lodge a whole amount in one go if you want to, but you need to make sure every month it still is maintained validity. Key documents there is work in practice 45. As I said, please look at that because you've got an updated process, and any letters of credit need to go through the SWIFT banking system. And make sure you're lodging the credit cover to the correct bank account. If you're submitting cash, it's ESC bank account, but that is all detailed in work in practice 45. So just remember, 15th of September is the first deadline for that. We went through the supplier charge because suppliers are required to make monthly payments to fund capacity providers for each month delivery year. And that happens on the first working day, so the first one we're going to see is the 3rd of October. The key documents for that is guidance document 2 and the EMR Settlement calendar, so you can see when your invoice dates are going to be. The exception processes we went through for non-compliance, so that's about if you don't lodge credit cover or make a payment, then the default, mutualisation and the non-payment process may be enacted, and that's all detailed in work in practice 41. Reconciliation, the monthly and annual reconciliations do take place. The key documents is the assessment calendar. Remember that gets refreshed when we get the BSC calendar roughly around March next year, so keep an eye out for that. So the important slide for some of you is the links. We've got the EMRS website, a nice picture, screenshot showing that on the right-hand side. You can actually sign up to our EMR circulars. If you've seen the little picture, top right-hand corner, it says subscribe here. So when we publish a new document, you'll get a little email to let you know. Settlement data page is quite important in our website. We've got the key figures for supplier payments in 2016-2017 published on there, and the settlement calendar. So that's the link to the settlement data page underneath those 2 bullet points. Of course, ESC has the credit default register and the non-payment register, so have a look at their website. Don't be confused when that link goes through and it's the low carbon contracts company as well displayed, because the 2 bodies are run jointly to make things more efficient, but they are ring-fence companies. They deal with the capacity market and the CFD scheme respectively. So you can find out all about their role on their website, but it is ESC, that's the main one for capacity market. And all queries, so we've tried to answer as many questions as possible today. If you have any more, please submit them to our contact mailbox. That's contact@emrsettlement.co.uk, and there is our number. If you'd like to speak to a human being, that's fine. We're at the other end of a phone. Any questions we haven't managed to get back to you on today during the webinar, with my colleague Abdul furiously typing away there for some people, we will get back to you individually, so please bear with us. And please check out our news and calendar for key dates on this website. The webinar slides will be on the Lexon YouTube channel. As I said, you'll get a link after the webinar, so you can click on that there. It's not on our website, so don't be confused when you can't see it, but you will see the slides being uploaded. So the last slide, just got to have a little plug here. The next event we have is on the 9th of November, and it's the Introduction to EMR. So that's actually taking place at the Lexon offices. It will be advertised on our website. Obviously, it's more of a high-level presentation. So we've had a lot more information in today's webinar. You might be bored, but your colleagues might be interested. So please, if you've got any new colleagues to the industry or people who've changed role recently, or just people who are interested in what EMR is all about, that is probably the best event for them to attend, just in case the slides today are a bit too much detail for them. So any newbies, send them along. Please register, but you can find all the information on our website. So that is it from me. We'll just have a little break for questions. We weren't planned, but I have got a couple of minutes left. So were there any questions, guys, that are worth having a look at now? Yep. Right. So good to finish it off. We've got these 3 questions that we can share. So the first question is, can we get invoices on flows for supplier charges, mutualisation, reconciliation, etc.? So all invoices will be issued with the backend data via the D0364. You have to make sure you've selected the DTN method when you registered with us. You can amend it if you've selected email method before. You can amend that. Please get in contact and our people will send you the amendment form and you can select the DTN method. And the next question is, can you provide a link to direct debit forms? Please contact the EMRS help desk that I showed. I'm just going to scroll back to that slide to keep it on there. Please contact the contact@emrsettlement.co.uk mailbox, and they will send you the direct debit forms directly, and they will support you with that process. So it's always good to know who's asking so we can help you with that. The last question is, assuming I submit a net demand forecast of 0, do I have a credit requirement of 0? Yep, because 110% of 0 is 0, so you won't need to worry about credit cover. But it is worth noting that if you forecast 0 and it turns out that in reconciliation runs you actually did have some demand in a period of high demand, and we issued that revised schedule. Remember, we revise the schedule. You may then see you will have supplier charges and credit cover requirements. So although you won't have it at the start of the year, you may see that when we revise it during the year. So please look out for that. That's all the questions I have for general sharing. Abdul has been typing away. I've seen him reply to people. If he hasn't managed to get around everyone, because there were quite a lot of people on today's webinar, please bear with us. We will get back to you, and the slides will be shared online and our YouTube channel. So that's actually it from me today. Thank you for sticking it out until the end. And on behalf of Abdul and Matt in the room, thank you very much for taking part. Bye.